So before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge that we are having this event on the unceded land of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kis people. And I also wanted to express solidarity with the IDA staff workers currently bargaining for better working conditions. Thank you for joining us physically, and also thank you for our virtual audience. And if you have questions for the virtual audience, feel free to put them in the chat, but I guess, yes, feel free to put them in the chat. I don't know how I'm going to access the chat. But I think that's all for the logistics. So I'm going to introduce our panelists as briefly as possible. So unfortunately, we were supposed to have 4 remarkable filmmakers with us today. Unfortunately, Mehrdad Oskouei, who is an Iranian independent filmmaker, is not able to join us because of what's happening right now in Iran. He was supposed to be here virtually. We're still going to play a clip of his 2016 feature, Stardust Dreams, about a youth detention center. And his work in general is a very long time commitment to that question of youth detention centers for boys and girls. But with us physically, we have Zaynê, Akyol, who's a Kurdish Canadian filmmaker whose first feature was looking at female freedom fighters, Kurdish female freedom fighters, but whose latest feature is looking at that question of ISIS incarcerated members in Kurdish prisons, and thinking, just juxtaposing those interviews with images of a militarized countryside, and thinking about that question of carcerality in Rojek from 2022. So we also have Dineen, trying to pronounce it well, who is a British filmmaker with more than 20 feature documentaries, mostly for the television and for the BBC, and whose work has focused mostly on questions of institutional change and the British society. And we will mostly be discussing Being Blacker from 2018, who look at a Black record shop dealer who was incarcerated during the making of the film. So you will tell us more about that. And then we also have Rodrigo Reyes, who is California-based, Mexican independent filmmaker, whose feature Sansón and Me from 2022 is looking at an incarcerated individual, Sansón, who is sentenced to life without parole and not able to participate in the process of making the film. So instead, we have this reenactment happening of his life. So I'm really excited to have that conversation with all 3 of you. And we will start by playing small clips of those films.
مامانت چرا نمیاد ملاقاتت معصومه؟
مادرم داش بزرگم دوست داره. داش بزرگم خلافکار دوزه، معتاده، الان زندان قزلستاره. خیلی دوست داره. از 11 تا بچه اونو دوست داره.
تو رو دوست نداره؟
نه، من هیچکی دوست نداره.
هیچکی منو دوست نداره. چند بار تا الان دزدی کردی؟
چند بار؟ اندازه موهای سر.
چیا دزدیدی معصومه؟
چیا دزدیدم؟ با خواهرم میرفتم کیف زنی. بعدن کیف خاپی و داداشم، تو خونه رویی و داداشم، کفتر دزدی و داداشم. کفتره کوکل به سر وای.
داداشت چجوری اذیتت میکرد؟
داداشم عوضی بود، برای جنسش منو میزد.
Blacker's shop was leased to someone else while he was away, and it's now a dress shop. The whole of Brixton is changing, as well as Blacker's life.
On the house, We're what? We're opening soon on the house. So what is that they're opening there?
It's an estate agent.
Oh, bloody hell, yeah. So right, anyway. Another one here. There's another one there. That's why they wanted to get me out, you see. Get Blacker out, we can do what we want. And Blacker is here. Everyone's coming to Brixton to see Blacker. We can't afford to do anything while he's here. Get that bugger out. We have to get him out of Brixton, mate. Hold on, the great Silver Wonder. Oh, fire. A great selfie.
It's a party.
Man. You good?
Yeah, man.
Oh, that my sister.
I'm good, I'm good. Yeah.
أتخيل الجنة الموجودة يعني حسب ما وصفت لنا أعماركم بين 30 و33 سنة. خالد في هذا العمر، عمر الشباب موجود دائما، فنقدر نقول نشوف أنهار ما توصف وأشجار وغابات وش مش تشتري نفسك. الفاكهة معروف إنك تقطفها من الشجرة طيبة جدا، أخص حين تأكلها تازة. أوصاف ما توصف. يكون واحد عنده مثلا معروف في هذا الشيء في الرجال، يكون عنده مثلا نساء كثير ولم يطمثن أنس ولا جاء من قبلك، مثل الحوريات الموجودات في الجنة. خدم لك ما تشتهي نفسك، قصور بيوت ما يتوقع الإنسان ولا في المخيلة. صعب أوصف الوصف اللي يكون فيه الواحد إذا كان في الجنة. وما نعلم من علم الغيب، لكن نقول إن شاء الله نبتغيها.
¿Hace cuántos años que no ves a tu hermano?
Hace 14 años. Nos despedimos. Me acuerdo que él volteó, me dijo, no me digas adiós, dime hasta luego. Y se fue él y mi hermana y yo me quedé viéndolos. Y de allí para acá ya, nunca más. Mi hermano súper contento que en su mirada, en su persona no se miraba nada de eso.
¿Nada de qué?
Nada de la cárcel, nada de que se fuera a ver una situación como la que tiene ahora. Nunca lo miramos así, nunca lo miré así. Al contrario.
So maybe to get started, while the audio issue get fixed, you can introduce your films and tell us a little bit more about not just the project of the film in itself, but your relationship to prisons. If it started with the film or if you had a pre-existing relationship to that issue and that topic.
Do you hear me? Yeah. So my name is Zaynê Akyol, and I didn't have any relationship to prisons before this film. Actually, I did this film because, as Chrystel mentioned, my first film was about Kurdish women fighters who were fighting the Islamic States. And after making a film about their ideology and their way of living and their way of trying to create a democratic, feminist, ecologist society in Iraqi Kurdistan, I thought it would be very interesting to see the opposite side, who they are fighting. And who they are fighting, so the film is, that's my second film that we're going to discuss, and so it's called Rojek, and it's about members of the Islamic State who are in jail in Syrian Kurdistan. So it's mostly conversation that I have with them about their ideology, the organization of the Islamic State, even the timeline, what happened during the war, their personal story, of course, and I also try to describe what is happening outside of the jail. So how a country after 10 years of war is trying to get out of this destroyed society, destroyed basically everything. So I'm always constantly going from those conversations to outside of the jail. I think I can summarize the film like that. Of course, it's like more complicated than that, but I try to make it short and simple. Did you have any other question, Chrystel?
No. My film is not set in a prison at all. It's started with me filming an old friend of mine, a Jamaican man called Blacker Dread, filming his mother's funeral, which was extraordinary. And it was so extraordinary, I said, shall we carry on filming? I'd filmed him 40 years ago when he was running a Jamaican sound system. And he was quite a big figure. But I'd made a very musical film back then. And this, to me, was revisiting a subject, but I was older, he was older, and I was meeting his family. And I don't know why he said yes, because I started following him and realised he was packing his life up. And at the heart of what was happening is he was going to prison for the first time in his life. He was 60. And so it was bizarre because he was an old friend, and I knew he was very humiliated by it, and yet he wanted to tell his story. And what sort of unfolds is really the role that prison plays in this family's life. I didn't set out to do that. I think maybe that's why Jonathan Ali chose it for this session, because prison is there throughout the film, but we never physically go there. He just disappears from the film. And while he's gone, in fact, I go to Jamaica and meet his son and his partner. He's got 15 children, a lot of whom also are in and out of prison all the time. And it became a film about being black in Britain for the last 45 years, which I know seems a little bizarre that I, as a middle-aged white woman, should make. But I think we sort of did it hand in hand. He led me to tell a story he wanted people to understand.
And, for me, it's so interesting to be on this panel with everyone's relationship to incarceration being so different and distinct. In my case, it started with the work that this man is doing right here, the ASL interpreter. Actually, I myself am an interpreter, a Spanish interpreter in the criminal justice system. And, as you can imagine, there's someone on the other end of this interpretation, right, of this process of wanting to relay information. And I was in the middle of that. And on the other side was a young man facing his first murder trial, a first-degree murder trial. And it was my first murder trial as an interpreter. And we were there doing this relationship for 3 weeks during this really, really tough trial that ended with a sentence of guilty and 2 life without parole terms for him. And during this whole process, I never got to talk to him as a person. I was always just like a tool of the court to relay information and deliver information from him to the court, right? Or help him talk to his attorneys. But I couldn't even say, how are you feeling today? Like, where are you from? And I had all these questions like, how does a young man end up being charged at 19 years old with a double first-degree murder case, and then ends up sentenced to life without parole? He wasn't the shooter, but he was there, and I just had so many questions, and I realized like the reason I was so interested is because I was the only other Mexican in that room that he could really relate to, and yet we were impeded, by the system, right? And so I was talking about this a lot, in a much more kind of emotional way. And then I met a friend of mine, my producer Sue Kim, and she said to me, one of the first things that she said to me was like, just look him up and write to him. Maybe he wants to talk to you, and maybe there's a film idea that we could work on. And he did want to talk to me, and he did want to make this movie. So that's kind of the genesis of the film. And what the film really captures is that relationship and that collaboration that we try to put together.
Thank you. Something that I find really fascinating across your films is those very different relationships that you established with the people you were filming, from like long-term friendships, is emerging and developing friendships, and also very more tense situation and interactions which are not based on that paradigm of friendship that's oftentimes centered in filmmaking nowadays, to think about ethics and to think about the relationship with the people we film. So I think it's interesting to think about how do we establish those relationships, how do we think about consent, especially in contexts where people are structurally in a very vulnerable position, and consent is always a very complicated process. And yes, if you could speak a bit more about how you thought about consent and about the ethics of all of your projects, and how that also maybe shifted as the project evolved.
So, as you mentioned, in my case, it was very tricky because most of the women who I filmed in my first film died fighting ISIS, and then I was in front of ISIS. So there was no other choice than being really honest with them, because I want to understand their brainwash and their way of thinking, how they can justify such an act. So when I introduced them, myself to them, I just explained who I was, who I am, what I did, what kind of film I did, what is my intention, which is really to understand their personal story. And as you can imagine, I met maybe over 100 ISIS members, and half of them refused to do the film for different reasons. Even just like talking to a woman, for them it was too much. And at the end, I had 50 interviews in the film, and with the editing, I end up just with 15. And they did it for different reasons. I was not really, I think I created a relationship with them anyway, because even though they did horrible murder, and as we can all remember, they were cutting heads, and propaganda videos were all around the world in the media. So it's hard to be in front of such as like human that have been out of their humanity, but in the same time there is always something that we can connect. So even though it was a short-term relationship, when I was, for example, talking about their family or my family, or how like we see anything, relationship, parents, they had this sensitive and emotion that I could relate. So it was a really strange feeling, because I was in front of people who thought I was brainwashed and who I thought they were brainwashed. And for them, it was also an occasion to talk about their ideology. When I was in front of them and like asking them questions about Islam or fundamentalism, because I think they thought but I think for them it was a way also to spread their ideology, or to make sure that they are here. There were all kind of relationship in my film. Sometimes people, which is really rare, sometimes they regret what they did. So they want to show to the world that they regret. Sometimes they want to spread their ideology. Sometimes, so it was all different reason why they accept to be in the film. It's like it was. There was no other choice than to be honest, and you know, Islamic States harm most of the people that they harm were Muslim. And Kurdish people who fight the Islamic States on the ground are 80% Muslims. So, so I was not in a position that I was like, I really tried to understand the fundamentalist way of Islam. So the relationship was not really like, they were not my friend, because sometimes it was just like one day, and it was that occasion that they had time to talk with someone or talk about their ideology. Or sometimes in the case of another person, it was like a week of relationship where the woman that I interviewed tried to convince me. So it was all different kind of relationship, I can say.
With a given person, for instance, like what's the time frame? Like, do you speak once, twice, over a couple of weeks, days?
So we stayed in Syria for 4 months and a half, 5 months almost. So it depends of who, like, as I mentioned, like some were for a week of a relationship, some were like, you know, we start to film them at the beginning of the film, and then I come back to see them after a few months. So, but it was in that time frame of 5 months.
Molly and also Rodrigo, where it's a very different relationship, and I'm feeling like friendship is also, like, this terrain seems obviously very like tricky, as you mentioned, but friendship is also a very murky terrain in terms of negotiating a relationship from being friends to being a filmmaker who's filming a friend. So if you could talk to that.
Yeah, I think, because I shoot myself and don't use a sound recordist either, so I use an onboard mic and then I radio mic the main subject, providing that sort of, you know, once you radio mic somebody, it can affect the relationship. So, but most of the time, because it gives me the freedom to then move around. And with that, and him being somebody I know, I think you have to create your own rules, because what you're really trying to do is inveigle your way into somebody's life and world and friendships and family. And it got, you know, I got very deeply into his family situation, and then you have to be very respectful, because if it's going to go out publicly, they're not thinking of that, because we are prioritizing our relationship. And my job is to try and make the camera disappear. I mean, of course, it's evident. It's a big camera and there's a mic, so I'm not hiding it. But I'm obviously trying to do everything I can. It's what I do to overcome that, so that the subject speaks directly to the lens, therefore directly to the audience, so that you feel an intimacy, and that's the objective. Therefore, I have to be very careful not to abuse that. What I always do is show everybody in the film when it's rough enough that I could honestly adapt things if there are things that are a problem. And, you know, it was strange to me. There were times that Blacker clearly wanted me to cover something. There were some occasions, I can't think of anything he actually stopped me shooting, but other people would stop me. And I suppose as when he came out of prison, he took slightly more control about what we shot. He made sure that I came to a vigil of a young black British boy. A teenager has been stabbed outside school, and Blacker takes me to the vigil and makes sure that that's an aspect of it. Because I think what he's trying to say, and the reason he did it and did the film, is because he wanted people to understand what it's been like living in Britain, because Britain is not entirely honest about its racial situation.
And for me, like, I feel like every documentary is grounded in like a pact, right? Like we make a pact, we propose a pact to like reality, to the people that we invite or that invite us into our film. And with Sansón, you know, there was a huge power dynamic. There's a huge power dynamic. I'm very fortunate to have been an immigrant with a library at home. You know, even though my family didn't have a lot of money, that library changed everything. He didn't have that. He didn't have parents. He saw me as the expert at the beginning. And so that pact had to address that. And it also had to be ethical, you know, but not moral, right? I think we have a duty to be ethical, but not to be moral, not to be, you know, calling the shots of who's good and who's bad. And I had to sort through all that with him in the beginning, you know, because he was like, well, They say I'm a bad guy. I don't think I'm a bad guy. I'm not a monster, like the district attorney said. We have to sort through all of that. And it took a long time to really build trust and just a lot of luck. Like he got to see one of my films on PBS early on, Inside. He was at Pelican Bay. For those of you that know about prisons, that's like a terrible prison here in California. He was there and he saw my film and he was like, oh, okay, this is the kind of work you do, And he was like, it's really intense, but it looks very professional. But he's right? Like, he's like, who are you, right? Like, who are you? And I had to kind of build that trust. And but then once we agreed at our center, and he agreed that the film wouldn't also be like a case to, revert his sentence or, one of these documentaries or pieces that we see where like we try to like overrule the system in a very overt way, that it was more about his story and his humanity. Like we had to agree on all of that, and he had to agree to write these scenes that then that's what I failed to mention, his own family agreed to be the actors in the reimaginings. So there was this constant process of trust and going back and trust and going back, and even accepting when we made mistakes. And like, so now we have like this kind of commitment, the film is done, but we're in conversation all the time of just like saying things to each other like that we see. And so like, I have to send him reviews of the film for this film that he hasn't been able to see yet. And he's engaging with the pact that we made, and we're all continuing to fulfill that commitment. But it's so unique because we're friends, right? Whereas in your case, it's like that's not what's ethical, right? And so it's really funny because the underpinnings of all our conversations with Sansón is always like, what's the pact that we have? How do we address that? Where is it in this moment? And I'm really enjoying that process, and I think he is too.
I just wanted to ask a question, which is how important do you think it is for the audience to feel that the main character is in fact not guilty of doing something that's really bad? Because there's this problem of being seen to be a silly liberal filmmaker who's not actually looking at the situation and the harm inflicted on someone else.
Well, I'll try to answer as honestly as I can.
Because I thought in your film, I loved the fact that it was quite abstract. I felt he wasn't responsible and shouldn't have had that sentence. I may be wrong, but that's what I felt.
But, and I'll be really honest because this is an American audience, we've been really colonized here in the U.S. So many people ask, like programmers ask about this stuff, and they somehow think that because the case is unclear, like that somehow the film is not trustworthy or exploitative. And you know why? Because in the U.S., we don't understand a very basic thing, which is human rights. We don't understand the concept that someone is a human being that deserves dignity and doesn't deserve this crazy sentence. So people always get stuck on like, did he do it? Did he not do it? And it's like so ridiculous, I think, to talk about prison from that lens, because you're only giving the prison more power. Whereas in other countries, even in Mexico, for instance, which is super corrupt, everyone understands like it's unfair for a young kid to be sentenced to life. And in the UK, like the same thing, right? And so I feel like we're very audiences and just the film industry here is very colonized by the very mindset of prison. We're using prison's own standards to discuss and think about prison stories, and we're not breaking through that.
Yes, I don't think it's just a US issue, honestly, but I agree with you that there is this ideological weight of the prison, which forces you to think about it in certain ways and frame the question in terms of the sentencing and the act. Was it done? Was it not done? Guilty, not guilty? Those are the frames through which we are forced to think about prisons all the time. And I think it's interesting to adopt projects that don't necessarily try to frame the question in that way. And why does it raise so much pushback when you're not immediately addressing that question? Did he do it? Did he not do it? But I'm also thinking that in all of your projects, and that's why I also don't want to frame it as a US issue, in all of your projects there is that looking at the different locations you're occupying, there is also it also kind of blurs the boundaries and the kind of ideological divides that are being established between different kinds of prisons and different kinds of geographies. And I'm thinking about that distinction between the military and the police, the domestic, the international. Like in your case, and the Kurdish prison, there is very much that sense of like alien or foreign individuals being processed by a state. While in your case, it's a domestic, it's someone who is being processed by a domestic system of punishment and incarceration, and similarly in the UK case. So I'm thinking about how you're thinking about the geographies and the way we think about representing prisons, the physical space, or the impact of the prisons in the everyday lives of the people who are being incarcerated or their loved ones, in terms of a history of representations that try to separate those geographies and that try to project very specific images of what those realities look like. And if you work with a cinematographer or not, what were some of the pitfalls you were trying to avoid in terms of representing, or in terms of not representing that question of prisons?
So in my case, a lot of Islamic State people were from different countries. So, and when the war started in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's regime just were not anymore in power, and Kurdish people took back their ancestor land and they established their own autonomous government. And so the jail that they have is not a real jail, if I can say so. It's like some makeshift jail that they just improvise because they don't have the money nor the technology or the people to take care of those jailed people. So I used to say it's the United Nations there, because really people were from everywhere. And Kurdish people didn't want those foreign Islamic States members because they don't have anything to take care of them. They don't have the system, the right system. They don't. So, and the problem is that other people don't want them. Even they took back their citizenship. So the countries that is supposedly be fighting for democracy or are democratic are actually not treating their own citizen as that. So it's a big issue. And so they are in jail, and and they run. Let me restart that sentence. When the war ended, all the Islamic people run to the Kurdish area because the death penalty is forbidden. They don't have that. While in Assad or in Iraqi government, they still hang people. So because of that, most of the Islamic State's people are in jail in the Kurdish part. And it was very tricky for me also to even film the jail because it's very secularized jail, and the information that can be out, you have to be very careful too, because some sleeper cells were attacking when they know where's the jail and how the jail is configured. They attack those jails and try to make people out of the jail. So it was really tricky the way that I was filming. We had also some collaboration with the manager of the jail of what we can film, what information can be out. So yeah.
But you're not just filming inside the jail. You're filming.
I was filming inside of the jail.
Yes, you are filming inside,
yeah.
But you also have images of this field that's burning.
Yeah.
You also have images of, I don't know if it's a camp.
True. Okay. Yeah.
Can you speak about like how you think about the relationship between those spaces, mm-hmm. and where does the prison start? Where does it even end?
So I really tried to film the Kurdish part of Syria, and we had a drone, and I thought like destruction cinematographically always look beautiful, and it's also this idea of how this ideology spread so fast and devastating all the land. So in the film there is this metaphor of burning fires that it's burning all the lands and the devastated land, the militarized population, because sleeper cells are everywhere, so everything is militarized, controlled, everything is burning also. So the jail actually never ends. There is always control everywhere. There is always fear everywhere. And I think it's represented in different ways in the film. Yeah.
Rodrigo, talking about the jail that doesn't end. In your case, you were not able to film inside the jail. Can you speak a bit more about how you chose the spaces that you decided to indeed film, and how you think about this? What does the prison does to space, and how you thought about that in terms of cinematography?
Well, to me, like, I didn't really think in terms of space as much as I did first and foremost in terms of voice. And I think that's what incarceration does to people, is take their voice away. And it's exactly what it's designed to do to folks like Sansón that are lifers in this country. He doesn't speak English when he goes in, and he's told that, you know, he can't tell his life story in his trial, and then I'm told I can't interview him. So there were like all these walls, and so we had to kind of build a space for his story to live in. But it took a lot of conversation and just in exchanging, you know, experiences, and me going back and forth to his home, meeting his family, helping him reconnect, and then build those spaces from there. Because he would write and he would say, "Oh, I remember walking down the street, you know, like when I walking down the street from school and finding out that my dad had passed away, when I saw a huge crowd of people, right?" And so like I had access to these spaces, and there had to be this relay from his letters to the reimagining of those memories in real life. And so the spaces were just kind of constructed in the film based on that. And what's really interesting is that now when the family has seen the film and people who lived through some of the stories, they really kind of have this affection for the spaces we created, because they have this sense of this child point of view, and they also have this kind of beauty of that's inherent behind everything that's going on in his home region, which has a lot of conflicts and everything. And so it's almost like I had to build spaces with the gut feeling of what the essence was that he was trying to relay. Because literally all I have from him as a documentary text are his letters, right? So there was a lot of risk taking and like trying to kind of hit that emotional center in the space, and allow it to kind of live in this feeling of like, well, this is so subjective, right? And it's okay, because that's exactly what has been denied to him in the carceral system.
And in your case, you pass through multiple geographies, so the film doesn't just stay in the UK, but you also go to Jamaica. And if you could speak about Brixton, the UK and Jamaica, and you're thinking about those interconnected geographies in relationship to prisons.
At the moment, I believe, in fact, the British government are paying a huge amount of money to build a massive prison in Jamaica. There's something very bizarre going on with Jamaican British people and the attitude to them. As you know, we had this big Windrush drama when it became clear publicly how, in fact, the Jamaican community had been treated, people who'd been invited to come to the country and work but weren't given British passports and are then being deported. It's a funny one. When you start a film and you don't know where it's going, but it takes you into the territory of prison, and then you find yourself on this panel talking in terms of prison. It's complicated because I realise there's a lot of prison in the film, but it's also the reason I chose to focus on it, and in fact his another big character in the film has spent more of his adult life inside than out. And he's called Naphtali. He's very funny, he's very charismatic. I meet him at the beginning of the film because he's driving crazily, escorting the cortege with the coffin through London. And I say, oh my God, you should be a getaway driver. And he says, I was. And then he explains his years and years and years. He did banks and post offices, he's covered in gunshot wounds. And again, I was aware that people could think, oh, you're just, as a filmmaker, you're just excited now by the inherent drama in this. And I was very self-critical about that and how to handle it. But what saves it is the way, in fact, the characters talk and present themselves. And I think Naphtali is, I hope you agree, but just beautifully honest about himself, his life, what he felt as a young black person in England, how much they just all needed and wanted stuff, none of which they could get. There was no employment, the police were racist, and bit by bit, you enter a life of crime. It's how you're going to get what other people have, but you've got to go about it that way. And he talks about that during the part of the film that Blacker is away. And I also go to Jamaica and talk to his son, who was excluded from mainstream school in England. So had he not taken him to Jamaica, he'd now be in the prison system in the UK. So it becomes a very sort of complex film that's entirely on the streets and houses of England and briefly in Jamaica. But hopefully its reach is broad, which is to understand the role that prison plays in the black community in Britain. It's quite a muddled answer, but it's because of trying to keep it prison-focused.
Yes, no, it makes sense as an answer, and I think in both of your cases, there's this question of migration and the carcerality, and also like the multiple forms of carcerality that follow a migrant life, that takes different forms, which means that it's not just about the prison as the punishment center, but also at some point, Blacker says, Mehrdad stayed in Jamaica. I think it's his sister who says that his heart always stayed there, and that he never really felt like.
No, and he came to England as a very bright boy, and he did very well in his exams, but the school didn't believe him, and they made him take his exams again. So, but again, I didn't know any of this. I'd met him 40 years ago, but I knew nothing about him. So the privilege, but also the tragedy of this story unfolding. And he's sent to a smart grammar school, but he's one of 6 black boys in a school of 1,000 white kids. And he's brutally bullied. And he gets his revenge. And there's a very big, ugly fight happens, and then he's sent to a school that's entirely, he said, I never knew there were so many black people in England. And he, as it were, finds his people, but begins a completely different life, runs away from home, lives rough. So it's the unfolding of an individual's life, and you begin to understand why he's ended up doing a prison sentence at 60, because actually he's just sort of snapped, because so much is going against you. But the film I wanted to make, if he hadn't gone to prison, would have been a total celebration of the brilliance of his record shop and how it became this community hub in Brixton.
Which is, I think, what is interesting about all 3 films, but also Mehrdad, is it's not necessarily about the prison as this sensationalist topic or like something that's so exceptional or different from everyday life, but it shows, which is why I was asking, where does it start, where does it end, how embedded it is in everyday life, even if we have this idea of it as a very essentially different space.
Can I just jump in? So having spent more than a decade sitting in courtrooms, right? I mean, I think, specifically in this country, I could speak to that. People think that the court is where these things get addressed, and it's not. It's just the cleanup crew. Very sophisticated, very expensive, just the cleanup crew. And the fact that nobody cared to, listen to Sanson's story, that there was no entry point to that story in the system that was judging him and sentencing him to life just tells you everything about prison, because he had so many things stacked against him. When his dad passes away when he's 6 years old, and his mom dies when he's 7, and he's just figuring it out. And so the impact and the failure of society, prison, had been following him his whole life. And I think the fact that we can't recognize that is really, really tragic. And for me as an artist, it's like, well, that's my role, is to push that uncomfortable kind of truth out with this work, right? Because we think it's like a space, it's like a given institution, and it's actually like a whole system of invisible walls that follow people throughout their lives. And he's become very aware of that, in the telling of this film, and in thinking, well, like, how's my story living in the world? And there's something really, really brave about that, of resisting that larger prison. That I'm just so proud of him that he's willing to do that.
And resisting that ideology of separation as well, and thinking about how you've, and it's my last question before I open to the audience. So also for people who are joining you virtually, please, you can put question in the chat. But how you're thinking about how the film circulates as a finished product and not as a project. And the fact that the people you interacted with in some instances may not have access as easily to it. Like, how you're thinking about those people, not just as interlocutors, but also as potentially an audience. Like, how you're thinking about the audience of the work, and how the film circulates, the life of the film as a finished project.
I was really nervous about it, for many reasons. And the BBC turned the film down. All my films have gone out on that, or Channel 4. And normally I've sort of made a film before I go for money, because I'm sort of slightly shooting from the seat of my pants and I don't know where I'm going. And broadcasters tend to want to know the beginning, middle and end. Well, how the hell do I know? Because I don't know where it's going. So I have done the odd bit of corporate prostitution to make money that pays for those gambles. And I'd got very far down the line, and the BBC turned it down because actually she was Jamaican, the head of documentaries, and she said, it's just too negative. We don't do enough programming about black people on the BBC to then have this portrait of somebody who's got the 15 children, the prison sentence, etc. She really appreciated the complexity of the story, and she said, it's my own story, it's everybody's story, but we're not ready for it. And it was a really weird sensation. And then a couple of years later, in fact, somebody different, there was a change of management, and they did accept it. But before it went out on BBC, we had what was much more rewarding, which was taking it round local cinemas. And although I was crapping myself, because I thought, okay, so I'm sitting on stage with two middle-aged Jamaican men, and we're telling this story. And do you know what? What was so moving and humbling was not only was it not none of the things I was anxious that would be picked on got picked on, but a lot of people were profoundly moved for a very simple reason, not because it's a great film, but because it was their story. So many women in the audience, their kids had been inside, their children were excluded from school. It was like a recognition, and that was a real eye-opener to me. You know, sometimes you make documentaries about subjects, you know what the subject is, and you want to find a way of illustrating it. Well, this was, I didn't really know how typical his story was, and in fact why he was wanting me to tell it.
In my case, you know, when Sansón watched my films on PBS, I realized this is how I get him to watch the movie without any censorship, any intervention. I don't want to ask the prison for permission to show him the film. They're not going to help me. And so we fought really hard for that. And that commitment was like way early on, like in 2014 or something. And so it's going to broadcast next year. He's going to see it, and all his friends are going to see it. And that's like really, really important for me, as is the use of the film to help provoke and energize other storytelling processes in the prison system and the prison impacted system with communities that have stories similar to Sansón's and that can watch the film and see a way into kind of taking power over their story. So we're working on that impact rollout, and also just little things like for instance, Sansón wrote a poem years ago, and we needed a song in the film, and I said, well, let's set his poem to music and make it into a song, into a corrido, a ballad. For those of you who don't know, there's a big tradition in Mexican music of ballads that tell stories, and he's telling the story of his childhood, and so that music piece has become very, very popular with the community, with his family, and we're actually going to make a music video that could just live freely, online, so people can start to engage with his story, and at a very direct level, because sometimes festivals and the work we do feels so removed from people's lives, and so how do we find ways to just bring it into community and get word of mouth and make it very accessible, and so and then at the same time trying to take care of that relationship. So for me, that's the success of the film, is the fact that it's finding ways to Sansón and to his universe.
So in my case, a lot of people joined the Islamic States from a lot of countries. So I think it's very important that that the film circulate and it's been seen by different people, different countries, especially in America, where America was the leader of the coalition and bombarding and still training Kurdish people and gunning Kurdish people. So helping in this fight, and a lot of other countries were also in the coalition. So far, the film is doing a cinema a festival circuit. So there is a few festivals that we are touring with the film, but unfortunately, I cannot show the film to the people who are in the film, because for different security reasons. So yeah.
I have a microphone here, so if you have a question in the audience, I'll bring it to you.
It's working.
Hi, thank y'all for all your beautiful intentions with the films that y'all have made. My name is Adamu Chan, and I'm a director. I just finished my first film called What These Walls Won't Hold, which is a personal doc about my experience being incarcerated and moving through COVID inside, and also the organizing that I was a part of and my community was a part of. And I think today I just wanted this is a comment, but also a question about how y'all have all kind of pointed out how these relationships are inherently unequal, and there are all these issues about ethics regarding relationships with people who were shooting. And I think for me, even now that I'm out and I'm here with Tan, who we were inside together, and we used to produce a television show on the inside of San Quentin. We were filmmakers inside that went out to all the prisons in California. And I recognized through that process the impact that had on the folks inside who had been impacted so much by media makers who had come in and were very, in some cases, predatory or exploitative, and even people who were trying to do good, but still weren't able to make those relationships reciprocal. And I think even for me, going through this process of making this film, now that I'm out, I have recognized that even the dynamic between myself and the folks that I still have relationships with inside, there is an inequality. It is an unequal relationship. And there are things that I need to do personally to address those inequities. And it's been really important for me to give folks producer credits or to pay people for their stories. And I think the other point is that it's really important for me to stay connected to the community and connected to folks who are still inside, and to advocate for them and to be a part of like organizing that's happening, and people who are like every day like organizing like politically against the system, and like understanding like the complexities of you know, leveraging like art and media in organizing efforts. And so I think, you know, today when I was coming to this, I was interested because there's no one who's formally incarcerated on the panel. There's no one who's like, maybe, I don't know, identifies as an organizer. But I guess my question to y'all is, do you feel like it's important to engage with those communities beyond just like your subject, you know, and the like individual person? Because I know that like prisons are inherently political space, right? They are not reflective of like the harm that exists in any society, right? It's about disappearing certain types of people in a society. And so I think just my question is like, is it important to y'all to like engage with people who are outside of your dynamic, who maybe aren't like addressing these questions like on a day-to-day basis? Sorry, it takes a little.
Thank you.
So in my case, it's the people that I interviewed. They are, for them, because they are following a fundamentalist way of practicing Islam, which is not Islam. It doesn't matter for them this life on earth. It doesn't matter what they did, because what they're expecting is to go to paradise. So unfortunately, my clip didn't work at the beginning, but it was like a minute of military chief of the Islamic State who explained what is paradise, what is waiting for him. And I wish we could like watch it all together, because
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think the sound issue is resolved.
So they want to die as martyr. They want to. This life really doesn't matter. So it's for it. I didn't feel that it was really unequal in the sense of they had their power in front of me. You know, they were ready to say what their ideology, what is it, and to spread it even with the camera. It was an opportunity for them. In my case, it's a really different relationship that I had. I didn't feel that they were maybe like with one or two over 100 people that I met, but I didn't feel that they didn't have their power. You know, they were very proud, very strong in their ideology. They wanted to explain me what is it and why they fight for and what is waiting and why I am wrong and why I should be killed. So it's completely different. And especially as a Kurdish woman, who we know that Kurdish were fighting them, it was even tougher for me because most of the women that I filmed died by fighting ISIS. So emotionally, it was so demanding. I didn't feel that it was unequal. Actually, I felt that they had even more power than me because I was emotional, you know, I was like affected by this relationship. I think a phone is ringing.
And just to jump in on that, thank you, Adamu, for your comment. And for me, like I respond to that from my center of where my center, every film should have a center, every filmmaker should have that. And for me, it's like my relationship to him. And the fact that he trusted me to craft a ballad of his life, you know, to bring artistry to that, right? And so I don't feel empowered to engage as an activist. I engage as an artist. But from that window, you know, the film is relating to that universe. We're reaching out to folks who actually taught Sansón in some of the workshops that he was allowed to go to, you know, on a very limited basis, because as a lifer, He was told, oh, like you don't need to go to this workshop because you're never getting out. So like, what's the point? But we've engaged with some of his instructors. We've engaged with folks working in the criminal justice system in Mexico and in the government in his hometown. And they're going to go to like a screening of the film in November, right? So we could have these conversations about like, what's happening systemically in those areas that touched his story. But like my real goal, and I think his interest too, is to kind of go through this experience of storytelling and find, like what he wants to do now with his life after 10 years inside, where he's finally, getting access to programs, and he's finally getting access to like lower restrictions. And so the film is really coming at a moment where his life is really shifting, whereas at the beginning he was so limited and he was so scared of really kind of engaging outside of his day-to-day situation, because he was in such a harsh context, right? He was in a level 4 prison. He was in isolation half of the time for those 10 years. So he was very scared of sharing anything about the film. And so now that the film comes out, there's going to be a huge responsibility for us to walk with him along that process once it's broadcast into facilities across the state and the country. We have to walk with him and like incorporate him into the process. And we're working on that actively as we develop our impact campaign.
I'm very interested in what you were saying about people who are incarcerated there. You implied resentment of people coming in from outside, making documentaries. Because I did try to get into Film Blacker. He was running the prison radio, which was, he did brilliant constructive things. He was also put in the same cell as his son, which was pretty hardcore. But I wasn't allowed in. But in a way, I'm interested in what you say, because I'm highly suspicious of the amount of broadcasters love prison series, because then they can get in there, nick everyone's stories. It's full of drama. Everyone's on the edge of their chairs. But, they're real people and real stories. And we have a lot of them in England. A lot of, it's like cop shows, it's a way of getting, it's sort of factual entertainment. But is that what you were implying when you talked about people feeling that they were just being slightly used by filmmakers from the outside?
Yeah, I can answer.
Do you mind asking?
So I want to answer that and ask a follow-up question also. So my name is Tran. Like Adamu named earlier, I was also incarcerated for 10 years inside of San Quentin State Prison, right? And San Quentin State Prison is a very infamous prison. So that means a lot of media people come inside seeking to extract stories from currently incarcerated people. And to answer your question specifically, I want to give a specific example. I don't know if people here are familiar with the documentary Cue Ball. If you're familiar with the documentary Cue Ball, what you don't know about Cue Ball, Rafael Cuevas, one of the main characters of Cue Ball, actually created a pact with the filmmakers. And the filmmaker said, 1, we would make sure we represent you in the best light. 2, we would make sure you're compensated. What happened was, what ended up happening was that they ended up taking the victims of Rafael Cuevas without his consent and putting it in the film and demonizing Rafael Cuevas, which resulted in 5 more years of his incarceration. And then when he was released, he was not compensated like he said he was. So that type of example is a dime a dozen at San Quentin, right? And this goes beyond just filmmakers, but especially for journalists, right? Journalists will come in saying that we're here to interview you for a specific story, and then they'll flip the story to demonize you, right? So my follow-up question, right, that I'm very curious about for Rodrigo, right, and I really appreciate, like, you named a lot of important things. For example, the power dynamics and the vulnerability of being currently incarcerated. You're in a desperate state. I was in a desperate state when I was incarcerated. Like, I was facing 75 years to life. I was desperate. And if someone came to me and said, I'm willing to tell your story, I'm not in the greatest of mind states to make an ethical agreement, right? So I think my question for you or anybody on the panel is, how do you address the power dynamic to reach an ethical pact? And then the follow-up, and in addition to that, did you, I'm curious to know, what was your pact, and was compensation a part of your pact? Because coming from disadvantaged communities and people who are traditionally incarcerated, we know that they are disadvantaged economically. So while we make these films and filmmakers make films, and even though we might not get rich from these films, we do make a profit, right? And the people who do not profit from their stories are the stories that we're telling. So I'm curious to know, one, about how do you address the power dynamic to reach an ethical place, to create an ethical pact? And then two, are you compensating Sansón or his family? Because I know they come from an impoverished place.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, and I'll answer backwards. So compensation wise, I was very upfront with him at the very beginning, because through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, it's really hard to do that. It could cancel your whole film. And there's also this worry that there's a law in California against profiting from your crime, right? Once you've been sentenced. And so we wanted to really avoid any problems. He was already kind of getting dinged and red flagged, and he had been sent to Pelican Bay. But as the relationship grew, we started finding other ways to provide support and compensation to the family. He has a credit on the film as a co-writer of the film. He also, if our impact campaign goes well, he'll be an expert who's compensated, advising the impact campaign. And so that way you circumvent, right? But always letting him know, this is what we're doing. And then with the power dynamic thing, I think it goes back to this idea that a lot of filmmakers were trained and taught and told by the world and by whatever program that we're good. We're morally good. And we're not. We're not. We're not saving the world because we make a movie. We think we are. And actually, we are punished when we don't think like that. And I see it all the time in the way films are programmed. The fact that the institutions that have power over us don't question that. The funders and the festivals, they don't really question that power. But we need to do that. And I worked really hard from the beginning to tell him, I'm not the expert. Don't call me señor. Don't talk to me as usted. Talk to me in the you. I'm like you. But I had to work to convince him of that. And it always bothered me for years that he kept saying, just whatever you want, just do whatever you want. And it's no, give me notes. What do you think about this? Are you okay with this? And it was just a process, and that's why it took 10 years, and I just didn't want to be part of the taking. He's had so many things taken away. Who am I to come in and say, well, I'm more knowledgeable and more sophisticated and intelligent, so I have a right to take something from you. That's not right. And if you watch the film, he actually agreed to put in things in the film that are very difficult to talk about, as about the case, and about his family, but he agreed to it because we came to a common vision, and I wanted to work towards that. I didn't want to use my power to then editorialize on his life, and he's just he's a foil, or he's a stereotype,
Thank you.
We have 3 minutes left, so maybe one more.
Yes, one more question.
Thank you. My name is Robert Adanto, and my pronouns are he and him. My question is for Ms. Akyol. It's interesting hearing you speak of ISIS in terms of being brainwashed. And I was reminded of a film I saw where a guy in prison tells this person that's interviewing him that prison's in your mind. Can't you see that I'm free?
That's exactly.
I just remembered that line, but, and you spoke, you said in this second question that in terms of the power dynamic that you were experiencing a whole lot of emotion because other women, other Kurdish women had died fighting this group that was beheading people that we all know. My question is two parts. What is the situation with the Islamic Republic in the region? Because we hear out here, oh, ISIS is in, they've been decimated, they no longer, but I'd love to hear that. And then in doing the film, what else did you discover other than what you already kind of knew who they were, like in terms of their ideology and extremists? And I like that you said that it's not Islam, it's a perversion of it.
No, of course it's not Islam because, as Kurds, we are 80% of Kurdish people are Muslim. So, and they are harming most of the people that they're harming are Muslim. But for them, the way that they think, if you're not following this fundamentalist way of thinking about Islam or practicing Islam, you are the enemy. You have to be killed. And as you beautifully said, for them, I was brainwashed. And for me, they were brainwashed. So it was a conversation of they trying to explain their ideology and telling me how wrong I am, and owning their whole power. Because for them, they were so proud. It was, they wanted to die as martyr because then they can access to the paradise, and that's matter. So what I discovered, it's a very interesting question you're asking, because from outside, before starting to filming this, Rojek, I was looking at the news, reading the news, and we heard that a lot of countries were helping, and I was not sure. I was quite we could see some footage, and then when I interviewed the Islamic States, they all told me that they have been helped by the Turkish government, because Turkish government sees the Kurdish as their worst enemy because they want the independency. So they have been trained by Turkish army. They have been take care in their Turkish hospital. Even some were speaking the Turkish, and I speak Kurdish, Turkish, French, English. So when I was speaking to them just in Turkish to see if they could respond. So it was like, they've been gone, they've been sent money, and still right now, they are in jail. But as I said, the jail are very basic jails, and Kurdish people don't have the training or even the structure to take them. It's a ticking bomb. So whenever Turkish government is bombarding the Kurdish part, then the Kurdish have to go to the border, protect their border, then they let the jail, with a bare minimum security. So even in Hasaki, which is in the Kurdish region in Syria, they attack, some sleeper cells attack those prisons and try to escape others that they were in. So, and when I do, for my films, in my case, I really want the government, different government, take their responsibility for them, then take back in their countries, because it is unfair, it doesn't, and even we create second citizen. So we're fighting as Western countries that we're democratic and everyone have the rights and we have to have trials, but still they left people there, and they don't, even the UK is taking back their citizenship. It's like a whole mess there. And for sure, the Islamic State is not dead. And I think the war, it should be against the ideology. So the ideology is problematic. And when, we have to fight the ideology. And it's
We're out of time, so we have to wrap it up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this panel, and please, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.